Hello again, J-Spot peeps, and welcome back to the J-Spot. I'm your host, Mr. J, and for those of you who have subscribed thus far, thank you. You nearly have my subscription rate up to 700, and I thank you so much for your support. And for those of you who are stopping by for the first time, welcome. And while you're here, if you enjoy this content, make sure you give a thumbs up like. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share with your family and friends. Drop a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what your thoughts are about what you hear. And make sure you hit that notification bell to be notified of content uploads going forward. Today, I'm going to be discussing American values. I'm going to refer to an article I wrote back in 2018 titled Defining America's Values, a matter of what, when, where, who, and why. Let's get right to it, shall we? Well, have you ever noticed or paid attention to how people will get on television and always say, this doesn't represent our values, American values, this is not what we stand for? Have you ever noticed the contradiction in what they say and what you actually witness with your own two eyes? America has a very, I would say, a cognitive dissonance about what America really is. On the one hand, they voice that America is not a racist country, that American values don't tolerate certain behaviors or bad behaviors or criminal behaviors and things like that. But on the other hand, when they see these things happening, they act like, oh, well, it's just normal. And it's just, only the people that are being treated this way deserve that. I mean, take for instance, how America right now, especially this current administration in 2025 and all of their supporters, its supporters are always talking about, oh, we just want to deport the criminals because immigrants are criminals and people of color are criminals, when 95% of the crimes that are committed in this country, especially violent crimes, are by Americans, white Americans at that. A contradiction in terms, wouldn't you say? So, here we go. I'm going to start off with a quote from Jared Diamond's Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. This is a direct quote. The values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are those values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs. Unquote. Now let's unpack that for a moment. He's saying that the values that people espouse, as I said previously about how America doesn't tolerate that, and we're not mean and we're not racist and we don't murder and we don't steal and we don't treat people with disrespect and we don't look down our noses at people and we don't take things that don't rightfully belong to us. Those very traits that they deny America of characteristics of America are the very characteristics and traits that gave them the power in this country to begin with. And I'll say it again, I'll read it again. The values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are the very values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs. Think about that. Now, it's been said that laws are only effective as effective as those responsible for the enforcement of those laws. And it is within this same vein that we Americans must reconsider how we define American values. Post the Roseanne Barr Twitter debacle some years ago, in 2018 when I wrote this, wherein Roseanne Barr compared former Obama senior aide Valerie Jarrett to an ape. Cable talking heads spent much of their time that very night and the following morning opining about how Barr's comments did not and do not reflect American values. To which I say, poppycock. It's a matter of what, when, where, who, and why. Now, when you think about them saying that what she said about Valerie Jarrett did not reflect American values, and think about what you've seen over the last 10, 11 years since Donald Trump has been on the scene. It matters in the context of something that then the talking heads referred to on more than one occasion: America's original sin, slavery. And since you brought it up, then let's talk about that for a minute from the standpoint of laws and values, all while asking ourselves what laws existed during that time, slavery, when, what values did so-called Americans hold to, where were these values most effective, who benefited from those values, and why. Answering these questions will, I hope, shine some much needed sunlight into that glass through which we see darkly. Moreover, as we explore these queries, be sure to on occasion refer to the above referenced quote, how the values that they say they don't like were the very values that gave them their biggest triumphs, their greatest triumphs. First, what were the laws concerning slavery? Well, initially there were no laws which specifically addressed the issue of slavery. Slaveholders were virtually free, no pun intended, to do as they pleased with slaves who were considered property and as such were not afforded rights or protections any more so than farm animals. The first notable law regarding slaves or other persons was Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. There's that word again, others. Commonly referred to as the 3/5 Compromise, the agreement between Northerners and Southerners at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 stated that slave owners could count 3 out of 5 slaves, or as the article referred to as other persons, a person. And because the number of congressional seats held by a state was based upon population, consequently, slave owners in the South enjoyed majority representation in the United States. Now think about that. Southern plantation owners and slave owners in the South at that time had more representation in Congress than did the North, simply because they were afforded the luxury of counting a slave or others as 3/5 of a person. Even though they didn't treat them as such, they were able to count them as such. There's that dissonance again. The values they said they despised were the very values that gave them the greatest triumphs. The very values that gave them the greatest triumphs. And what were American values? When were those values held? And by whom were they held? And why? Answer to number 1. What were American values? American values during slavery were based on enriching some Americans absent having to work for those riches, and doing so at the expense of other persons that Americans considered less than a person. 2. When were those values held? American values were held at a time when applicable laws either did not exist, or if so, supported and enabled those values. 3. By whom were they held and why? By whom were they held and why? American values were held and defined by those in power. They were held and implemented in places where those affected posed no threat to those values. In other words, the other people, slaves, they were no threat to those values, and were held because of a false sense of entitlement and superiority. Now let's digress for a moment and and address the law enforcement during slavery. Did you know that policing as we have come to know it did not exist in the South until slavery, and was formed exclusively, per Dr. Gary Porter in his article of 2013, in the History of Policing in the United States, Part 1, as a method to 1. Chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. This is when policing became a thing in the United States, only to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. 2. To provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. Again, violence, physical violence, fear, terrorism. And 3, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. Following the Civil War, these vigilante-style organizations evolved into modern Southern police departments, primarily as a means of controlling freed slaves who were now laborers working in an agricultural caste system, and enforcing Jim Crow segregation laws designed to deny freed slaves equal rights and access to the political system. Now, it's a given that if someone is doing something criminal or wrong or criminal, and they face no consequence for it, why would they ever change? What would cause them to stop? What would cause them to cease and desist in that behavior? Nothing. Take, for instance, the immunity laws for policemen. What does that do for them? It tells them that any bad behavior that they engage in, they don't have to stop. So if the policing system was initiated and created to control black bodies, why is it that we're surprised that it hasn't stopped? Because they have no consequence for their action. They face no repercussions. There are a few sprinkled here and there, but if Trump and his cronies had their way, they would pardon every one of them. Take Emmett Till's trial, for instance. Men did what they want to do with that little boy's body. No consequences. Lynchings, no consequences. Initially, policing of slavery, the men that engaged in that, they were called paddy rollers. Hence the name paddy wagon. Rounding up property, rounding up black bodies. Does any of this sound familiar as it pertains to present day law enforcement and or political behavior? Though disputed in many circles, some even connect the term, as I said, paddy wagon to the infamous slave bounty hunters known as paddy rollers, in the sense that the former is an extension of the latter regarding rounding up disobedient blacks. Even more disturbing are the similarities between how law enforcement, policing, had no presence while blacks were being taken against their will and being raped, and the raping, pillaging, and murdering of the Indian, the native Indian. However, as soon as those who were stealing, kidnapping, raping, and murdering did their dirt, suddenly there appeared laws and the enforcement of those laws to prevent the victims of those so-called American values from reclaiming their victims' freedom and stolen possessions. And so, what were American values? When were those values held? By whom were they held? And why? The answers are the same as before. Fast forward to present-day America, and we see history repeating itself. The values of those with evil intent have taken center stage because those with evil intent are the ones in power, not because those values ever dissipated or died out. Those values have lived on in small pockets of America for decades, and those small pockets, guess what happened? Those small pockets became a coat, and they covered the Capitol on January 6th. They became a blanket and covered the Capitol with their evil intent on January 6, 2021. They've lived on in lynchings, continue to live on in housing and job discrimination, live on in municipalities, funding themselves off the blood, sweat, and tears of poor people of color. They live on in police departments, armed to the teeth with weapons of war to fight a citizenry. They, police, are sworn to protect and serve. They live on in the killings of unarmed black men, women, and children by police. They live on in the discriminatory application and enforcement of gun laws, and they live on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and sadly now once again in a White House whose occupant is valueless. The quote says, again, the values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are those values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs. Clinging to values under inappropriate conditions, racism and hatred. Values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs, slavery, theft, murder, oppression, disenfranchisement, and discrimination. Shocked by these values? I'm not. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. As I say, it's a matter of what, when, where, who, and why. Thank you once again, J-Spot peeps, for spending some of your valuable time here with me in the J-Spot. And I hope you enjoyed this content. Make sure that you drop a like. Make sure that you drop a comment. Make sure that you share with your family and friends and subscribe. And make sure that you come back to see me, because we have a lot more discovering to do and a lot more purpose to pursue. In the meantime,